They fought, and the outsider took everything. Part 1. The Fragile Empire. In the world of the ultra-rich, blood isn't thicker than water, it's thinner than a dollar bill. Two brothers, one inheritance, and a shadow that watched them bleed. Do you think you're safe because you're family? Think again. The most dangerous enemy isn't the one across the battlefield. It's the one whispering in your ear while you're distracted by the fight. Story. The Sterling Empire wasn't just a company, it was a kingdom built on the skyline of Manhattan. Arthur Sterling, the patriarch, was a man who ruled with an iron fist and a cold heart. But as his health faded, the scent of power began to rot the air. He had two sons, Elias, the eldest, a calculated Ivy League strategist who believed the throne was his by birthright, and Julian, the younger, a charismatic, high-risk visionary who believed the future belonged to those bold enough to seize it. They were brothers, but they were also mirrors reflecting each other's insecurities. Between them stood Marcus, the family's longtime legal advisor. To the world, Marcus was a loyal shadow, a man who had served Arthur for 30 years without a single stain on his reputation. He was the outsider who knew where every body was buried, every tax loophole, and most importantly, every grudge the brothers held against one another. The tension broke the night Arthur fell into a coma. The brothers didn't meet in the hospital room to pray. They met in the boardroom to argue. Elias wanted to stabilize the stock. Julian wanted to launch a hostile takeover of a tech rival to prove his worth. Marcus sat in the corner, his face an unreadable mask. He didn't speak. He just watched the cracks form. He knew that to destroy a fortress, you don't need a battering ram. Battering rams are loud. You only need to convince the guards that they are each other's greatest threat. As Elias and Julian shouted, Marcus quietly slipped a confidential folder onto the table. It wasn't a will. It was a fabricated ledger suggesting that Julian had been embezzling funds to fuel his private ventures. Elias's eyes turned cold. He didn't ask for an explanation. He saw what he wanted to see, a reason to eliminate his rival. But Marcus didn't stop there. An hour later, he sent a leaked recording to Julian, where an AI-manipulated voice of Elias discussed permanently removing Julian from the board. This is the divide and conquer strategy combined with induced paranoia. When humans feel threatened, their reptilian brain takes over, prioritizing survival over logic. Marcus wasn't creating a fight, he was simply providing the weapons and convincing both sides that the other had already pulled the trigger. By fueling paranoia, he ensured they would never talk to each other, only at each other. The outsider wins when the insiders stop communicating. In any hierarchy, the person who controls the flow of information controls the outcome of the war. Never let your anger toward a rival blind you to the person handing you the sword. Part 2. The Poison Table. Fear is a slow-acting poison. It doesn't kill the body, it kills the trust. When you start looking for betrayal in every smile, you've already lost the war. But what if the person pouring the wine is the one who poisoned the glass? In the Sterling house, dinner wasn't a meal. It was a battlefield where silence spoke louder than screams. A week after Arthur Sterling fell into a coma, the atmosphere at the family estate in the Hamptons became suffocating. Marcus, the loyal advisor, suggested a private dinner for the two brothers to reconcile. He chose a setting of absolute luxury, fine crystal, vintage scotch, and a table long enough to host a dozen people. Yet only two sat there, miles apart in their minds. Marcus played the role of the humble mediator. He served them himself, moving like a ghost in the shadows of the dim dining room. He didn't just bring food, he brought whispers. Before the meal, he visited Elias in his study, showing him intercepted emails from Julian's legal team discussing a mental competency hearing to have Elias declared unfit to lead. Then, he went to Julian, showing him a falsified security report that suggested Elias had hired private investigators to dig into Julian's past debts. At the table, the silence was jagged. Every time Julian reached for his glass, Elias saw a man hiding a secret. Every time Elias looked at his watch, Julian saw a man planning a coup. Marcus stood at the head of the table, pouring a deep red Cabernet. He leaned in and whispered to Elias, "He's unusually quiet tonight, isn't he?" almost like he's waiting for something to happen. Then, as he circled to Julian, he murmured, "Your brother looks remarkably calm for someone whose empire is crumbling. He must have a backup plan." The poison Marcus served wasn't in the wine, it was in the perception. By the end of the night, no reconciliation happened. Instead, Elias ordered a freeze on all joint accounts. And Julian contacted a rival firm to discuss a strategic exit, exactly what Marcus needed to tank the company's stock value. The emails and security reports were entirely fabricated by Marcus using the brothers' own private data. But the real twist? Marcus had bugged the dining table. He wasn't just watching them fight, he was recording their threats. He needed evidence of their mutual hostility to prove to the board later that neither brother was emotionally stable enough to lead, clearing the path for a neutral third party to step in. This is cognitive filtering, fueled by confirmation bias. Once Marcus planted the seed of betrayal, the brothers' brains filtered out any evidence of brotherly love and only looked for signs of aggression. Marcus utilized the Zeigarnik effect by leaving pieces of evidence incomplete, forcing the brothers' minds to fill in the gaps with their worst nightmares. When we are in a state of high stress, we don't see reality, we see our fears projected onto others. Be wary of the mediator who brings secret information from the other side. A true peacemaker brings people together to talk, a manipulator keeps them apart to whisper. If you don't verify the source of your anger, you become a puppet for the person who pulled the string. Part 3. The public bleeding. In the digital age, a reputation built over 40 years can be incinerated in 40 seconds. You think your private wars stay private? Think again. The most devastating weapon isn't a bullet, it's a leaked audio clip played on the 6 o'clock news. When the world watches you bleed, the sharks don't just swim nearby, they bite. While Elias and Julian were busy fortifying their internal positions, Marcus was playing a different game. He knew that control of the company didn't just depend on who sat in the CEO's chair, but on the confidence of the Wall Street investors. The Sterling Group was a public entity, and public entities run on trust. Marcus took the recordings from the poison table, the heated threats, the accusations of embezzlement, and the cold-blooded schemes, and began to carefully bleed them to the press. He didn't leak everything at once. He practiced the slow drip method. First, an anonymous tip to a financial blogger about Julian's supposed financial instability. Then, a grainy audio file sent to a major news network featuring Elias's voice calling the shareholders useful idiots. The media, hungry for a billionaire downfall, tore into the story like wolves. By Monday morning, the Sterling Group's stock ticker was a sea of red. The brothers reacted exactly as Marcus predicted. They blamed each other. Elias held a press conference to denounce the leaks as Julian's desperate attempt to sabotage the succession. Julian retaliated by going on a live interview, claiming Elias was mentally unstable and unfit to lead. As they tore each other apart on national television, the company's valuation dropped by $2 billion in a single week. The more they defended themselves, the more guilty they looked. They were so blinded by their mutual hatred that they failed to notice Marcus was the only one with access to both their private offices and the dining room where the recordings were made. The real bleeding wasn't just the audio clips. Marcus had also leaked a heavily edited version of Arthur Sterling's medical records, suggesting the patriarch's coma wasn't natural, but induced. He didn't name a suspect, he just left the implication hanging. Now, the brothers weren't just fighting for a company, they were being investigated by the authorities for foul play against their own father. Marcus had turned a family feud into a criminal circus. This involves social proof and the spotlight effect. Marcus used social proof to make the public believe the brothers were monsters, which in turn put immense pressure on the board of directors to distance themselves. The spotlight effect made the brothers feel that every move they made was being judged, causing them to panic and make erratic, irrational decisions. When people feel watched and judged, they stop thinking strategically and start acting defensively, which is always more destructive. Silence is often the best defense, but ego usually demands a response. When someone leaks your secrets, they are baiting you into a public reaction. If you react with anger, you confirm their narrative. The person who stays calm while the world screams is the only one who keeps their power. Part 4. The Boardroom Coup. Power is never given. It is taken when the owner is too busy looking the other way. In a boardroom, loyalty is a currency that devalues faster than a crashing stock. While the Sterling brothers were fighting for their father's crown, they forgot one thing. The throne doesn't belong to the bloodline. It belongs to whoever can keep the kingdom from burning. The 50th floor of the Sterling Tower was silent, but the air was electric with betrayal. The board of directors, a group of the most powerful and cynical minds in New York, sat around the mahogany table. Elias and Julian sat at opposite ends, refusing to even make eye contact. They were exhausted, their faces pale from the relentless media battering Marcus had orchestrated. Marcus entered the room not as an advisor, but as a concerned savior. He carried a thick stack of documents, the final nails in the brothers' coffins. He began his presentation by showing the 35% drop in the company's valuation. He played the leaked tapes again, this time officially for the record. He showed the police inquiry into Arthur Sterling's coma, framed in a way that made both brothers look like prime suspects. "Gentlemen," Marcus said, his voice smooth and devoid of emotion, "the Sterling name has become toxic. As long as a Sterling is at the helm, the market will continue to bleed. We don't just have a leadership crisis, we have a moral liability." He then proposed a neutral management trust. This trust would take over all voting rights and executive decisions until the legal investigations were cleared. Investigations that Marcus himself was secretly prolonging. Elias tried to protest, citing his birthright. Julian tried to charm the board with a new vision. But Marcus had already met with every board member individually the night before, promising them stability and personal kickbacks once the brothers were removed. One by one, the board members raised their hands. It wasn't a vote, it was an execution. By a unanimous decision, both brothers were stripped of their executive powers and placed on administrative leave. The Neutral Management Trust wasn't a group of independent experts. It was a shell company registered in Delaware, owned by a series of offshore entities that all led back to Marcus. By convincing the board to protect the company from the brothers, Marcus had effectively handed himself the keys to the entire empire. He didn't need to own the shares yet, he only needed to be the one who decided how they were voted. This is the scarcity and urgency tactic mixed with the common enemy strategy. Marcus created a crisis, the stock crash, to make the board feel that their wealth was in immediate danger, scarcity of time, security. Then, he united the board against a common enemy, the toxic Sterling brothers. When people are in a state of collective panic, they will follow anyone who offers a structured, calm solution, even if that person is the one who caused the fire. In a crisis, the person who offers order becomes the master. If you are part of a conflict, never let a third party manage your peace treaty. They will charge you the price of your entire inheritance for their mediation services. Part 5. The Margin Call. Money is a shadow. It's only as big as the light shining on it. But when the light of trust goes out, the shadow disappears. They say wealth buys freedom. But in the world of high finance, it's often the very cage that locks you in. Do you know what's worse than losing your job? Watching your net worth vanish while you're powerless to stop the bleeding. Following the boardroom coup, Elias and Julian were legally sidelined, but they still held massive amounts of Sterling Group stock. However, most of their personal lifestyle, their penthouses in Manhattan, their private jets, and their high-stakes investments were funded by loans secured against those very shares. This is a common practice among the elite, known as asset-backed lending. It works perfectly until the stock price collapses. Marcus knew this was their Achilles heel. Using his new control over the Neutral Management Trust, he purposely delayed the quarterly earnings report and leaked concerns about hidden liabilities. The stock price, already reeling, plummeted another 15% in 48 hours. This triggered a margin call. The banks that had lent the brothers hundreds of millions of dollars demanded immediate repayment or more collateral. Elias, panicked, tried to call his contacts at Goldman Sachs, only to find the lines cold. Marcus had already whispered to the bankers that the Sterling brothers were under federal investigation for their father's mysterious coma. Julian tried to sell some of his art collection to raise cash. But Marcus had tipped off the major auction houses that the provenance of the pieces might be tied to embezzled company funds. The brothers were trapped. They had billions on paper, but zero liquidity. They were drowning in a sea of gold. The ultimate betrayal wasn't the falling stock price, it was who was waiting to help them. An anonymous private equity firm offered to buy their personal shares at a 60% discount to save them from bankruptcy. Out of options and desperate to keep their homes, both brothers signed the deals. They didn't realize that the anonymous firm was yet another shell company controlled by Marcus. He was buying their birthright with the very money he had helped them lose. This is the sunk cost fallacy, exploited by induced financial stress. When people face losing everything they've worked for, they stop looking for the best deal and start looking for any deal. Marcus used the scarcity principle, making liquid cash seem like the rarest resource on earth. By cutting off their social and financial support systems simultaneously, he forced them into a survival mode, where their decision-making was impulsive and fear-driven. If you live by the sword of debt, you die by the shield of collateral. Never collateralize your future on a foundation that someone else can shake. The moment you are desperate for an exit, you lose all power to negotiate the price. Part 6. The Ghost in the Machine. What's worse than dying? Waking up to find that your world has moved on without you. And the person holding your hand is the one who stole your life. Arthur Sterling opened his eyes. But he wasn't a king anymore. He was a ghost in his own machine. And the operator was a man who knew exactly how to keep him silent. Miraculously, Arthur Sterling emerged from his coma. The news should have sent the company's stock soaring and brought the family together. But Marcus had anticipated this. Before Arthur could even fully regain consciousness, Marcus had already installed a private medical team at the Sterling estate, staff who were on Marcus's personal payroll. When Elias and Julian rushed to see their father, they were blocked, not by security guards, but by legal injunctions. Marcus had used the board-approved neutral management trust to argue that the brothers' presence would cause undue emotional stress to the patriarch, potentially triggering a relapse. He presented the court with the evidence of the brothers' public fighting and the police investigation as proof that they were a danger to their father's health. Inside the room, Arthur was conscious but frail. He couldn't speak yet, his throat dry and muscles withered. Marcus sat by his bed every day, leaning in close, whispering a distorted version of reality. He told Arthur that his sons had tried to have him declared brain dead to seize the inheritance. He showed him the news clips of Elias and Julian screaming at each other on TV, framed to look like they were celebrating Arthur's downfall. Arthur, trapped in a weakened body and a fog of medication, began to believe that his only loyal servant was the man who was actually keeping him a prisoner. The medical records Marcus had leaked earlier weren't just for the press. He had used them to convince a judge to grant him temporary legal guardianship over Arthur. The man who built the Sterling Empire was now legally a child. And Marcus was his parent. Every command Arthur tried to give, every document he tried to sign, had to go through Marcus. The king was back, but he was a puppet whose strings were made of legal tape. This is a brutal application of gaslighting and isolation. By controlling Arthur's entire environment and flow of information, Marcus engaged in reality engineering. When a person is physically weak and socially isolated, they become highly suggestible. Marcus didn't need to kill Arthur, he just needed to kill Arthur's trust in his sons. This is the Stockholm Syndrome of power. The victim begins to rely on their captor because the captor is the only source of truth available. Information is the oxygen of freedom. If someone controls what you hear, what you see, and who you talk to, they own your mind. Never allow a single person to become your only window to the world, especially when you are at your most vulnerable. Part 7. The Final Liquidation. The most painful way to lose everything isn't all at once, it's piece by piece. While you're forced to watch, a liquidation isn't just about selling assets, it's about erasing a legacy. When Marcus held the pen, He wasn't just signing contracts, he was signing the death warrant of the Sterling name. And the worst part? He made the family watch it happen. With Arthur Sterling under his legal guardianship and the brothers financially crippled by margin calls, Marcus initiated the final liquidation. He claimed the company was too far gone to be saved and that the only way to protect the remaining family wealth was to sell the Sterling Group's core assets to a private consortium. Of course, this consortium was the same network of shell companies Marcus had built in the shadows. Elias and Julian were summoned to the estate, not as heirs, but as minority shareholders who needed to sign off on the sale. The atmosphere was cold. They were brought into Arthur's bedroom, where their father sat propped up by pillows, tubes running into his arms. He could see them, but Marcus had drugged him just enough to keep his mind foggy and his speech slurred. "Sign," Marcus whispered to the brothers, placing the documents on a mahogany tray. "If you sign, the banks stop coming for your personal homes. If you don't, you'll be in federal prison for the embezzlement charges I've prepared." Elias looked at his father, searching for a sign of strength, but Arthur only stared blankly at the wall. Julian, broken and desperate for a way out of his mounting debts, was the first to grab the pen. He signed away 40 years of history in 10 seconds. Elias followed shortly after, his hand shaking with a mix of rage and defeat. As soon as the ink was dry, Marcus's demeanor changed. The loyal advisor mask fell away. He didn't offer a handshake or a word of comfort. He simply took the papers, handed them to his assistant, and signaled the security team. "The house is part of the liquidation," Marcus said calmly. "You have 1 hour to pack your personal belongings. The staff will assist you to the gate." The embezzlement charges Marcus used to threaten them were never real. He had no evidence that would hold up in court, but he knew the brothers were too paranoid and too divided to check the facts. He played on their guilt and their fear of each other. By the time they realized the threat was a bluff, the assets were already moved to offshore accounts where no U.S. court could reach them. This is the false dilemma, or black and white thinking, combined with loss aversion. Marcus presented them with only two extreme choices: sign and survive, or refuse and go to prison. In reality, there were many other legal paths, but under extreme stress, the human brain loses the ability to see nuances. Loss aversion makes the pain of losing what we have, homes, freedom, twice as powerful as the joy of gaining something new. Marcus used their fear of losing their status to make them give up their power. Desperation is a blindfold. When someone tells you that you only have two choices, they are almost certainly hiding a third one that favors you. Never sign anything when you are under the clock of a crisis. The person creating the urgency is usually the one profiting from your haste. Part 8. The Puppet Masters reveal. The most dangerous person in the room isn't the one holding the gun. It's the one who convinced you that you were the one in control. For 30 years, Marcus was a shadow. But shadows don't just follow, they wait for the sun to set. Now, the lights are out for the Sterlings, and Marcus is finally ready to show his face. The mansion was quiet. Elias and Julian had been escorted out by security, leaving only Marcus and the frail Arthur Sterling in the master bedroom. The machines beeped rhythmically, the only sound in the vast, cold space. Marcus walked over to the window, looking out at the sprawling estate that now, through a web of legal entities, belonged to him. He then turned back to Arthur, who was staring at him with a mixture of terror and recognition. Marcus pulled a chair close to the bed, but he didn't sit like a servant anymore. He leaned back, crossing his legs, radiating the cold confidence of a king. "You're wondering why, aren't you, Arthur?" he began, his voice a low, melodic purr. 30 years of loyal service. I handled your divorces, your lawsuits, your dirty secrets. You thought I was a part of the furniture. But furniture doesn't have a memory. I do. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old, yellowed photograph. It showed a small construction firm from the 1980s, the company Arthur had destroyed to build his first skyscraper. My father was your first partner. Arthur, you didn't just buy him out. You framed him for the safety violations that killed those workers on the 42nd Street site. He died in a prison cell believing he was a failure. I spent my entire life making sure you die in a mansion believing your sons were yours. Arthur tried to speak, his chest heaving, but Marcus simply adjusted the IV drip, slowing it down just enough to keep him weak but conscious. I didn't have to do much. Honestly, Marcus laughed softly. I just fed the ego you gave them. I whispered the lies they already wanted to believe about each other. You built an empire of greed. Arthur, I just used that greed to burn it down. Your sons are currently in the back of Ubers, heading to apartments they can't afford, blaming each other for a catastrophe I choreographed. The ultimate reveal wasn't just the revenge for his father. Marcus revealed that he had been systematically siphoning small percentages of the sterling wealth for decades. Long before the coma, the liquidation was just the final harvest. He hadn't just taken the company, he had already replaced the entire financial foundation of the family with his own. He was the real Sterling now, and the world wouldn't even know the name had changed hands. This is the long game of delayed gratification and social camouflage. Marcus practiced what psychologists call Machiavellianism, a personality trait centered on coldness, manipulation, and the exploitation of others. By remaining invisible, social camouflage, he avoided the brothers' suspicion. He utilized the reciprocity norm in reverse for 30 years. He gave Arthur loyalty only to build a massive debt of trust that he could eventually cash in for total destruction. Be careful of the people who never complain and never demand more. Silence isn't always loyalty, sometimes it's an investment. If you treat people like tools, don't be surprised when they eventually learn how to break you. The person you ignore is often the one who studies you the most. Part 9. The Fall of the Princes. The higher you climb, the harder the concrete feels when you hit it. For Elias and Julian Sterling, the fall didn't stop at the lobby of their father's tower. It followed them into the cold streets of New York, where nobody cares about your last name when your credit cards are declined. Poverty isn't just a lack of money for the powerful, it's the loss of an identity. 24 hours after being evicted, the reality of their situation set in. Elias was sitting in a dingy motel in Queens, staring at a laptop screen that showed his frozen accounts. His designer suit was wrinkled, and for the first time in his life, he didn't have a personal assistant to fix his problems. Julian, on the other hand, tried to use his charm to stay at a friend's penthouse in Tribeca. By the second night, that friend had stopped answering the door. In the world of the elite, failure is contagious, and no one wanted to catch the Sterling virus. The brothers, now stripped of their armor, met in a public park, the kind of place they used to look down on from their helicopters. The reunion wasn't touching, it was toxic. Elias blamed Julian's reckless exit strategy for giving Marcus the leverage to tank the stock. Julian screamed back, accusing Elias of being a weak, paranoid coward who fell for every lie Marcus whispered. Even in the dirt, they were still using the scripts Marcus had written for them. They realized that everything they owned was tied to the Sterling Group. Their names were blacklisted in every bank in Manhattan. Marcus had ensured that the embezzlement investigation stayed active in the media, making them radioactive to potential employers or investors. They were two highly educated, talented men who had been rendered completely useless by a ghost they had ignored for 3 decades. They were looking at each other, but for the first time, they didn't see rivals. They saw two broken mirrors reflecting the same tragic truth. They had burned down their own house just to see who could stand in the master bedroom. The ultimate blow came when they received a legal notice via email. Marcus hadn't just taken the company, he had filed a civil lawsuit against them on behalf of the trust for the recovery of lost assets. He was suing them for the very money they no longer had. This wasn't about the money anymore, it was about ensuring they could never rebuild. He was using the legal system to keep them in a perpetual state of defense, making it impossible for them to even focus on a comeback. This is the learned helplessness phase, when individuals are subjected to repeated failures and lose all sense of control over their environment. They eventually stop trying to escape, even when an opportunity arises. Marcus was also utilizing social ostracism, the psychological act of being excluded from a group. For the brothers, the loss of their social circle was more traumatizing than the loss of the money. Their brains were processing the rejection as physical pain. Your network is your net worth, but only as long as you provide value. If your power comes only from your title and not your character, you will find yourself alone the moment the title is gone. True power is what you have left when everything you own is taken away. Part 10. The Last. The dead have a funny way of getting the last word. You think a funeral is the end of the story? No, it's the beginning of the final reckoning. When Arthur Sterling's heart finally stopped, he left behind a document that didn't just distribute wealth, it distributed a final, crushing lesson in human nature. Get ready, because the truth is more expensive than the lie. 2 weeks after the final liquidation, Arthur Sterling passed away in silence. There was no grand funeral, no Manhattan elite lining the streets. Only Elias, Julian, and the ever-present Marcus gathered in a sterile lawyer's office for the reading of the will. The brothers, now dressed in cheap off-the-rack suits, sat side by side, united only by their shared destitution and a flickering spark of hope that their father had hidden one last safety net for them. The lawyer began to read. The room felt like a tomb. Arthur's voice, captured in a pre-recorded video, filled the space. He looked frail, but his eyes were sharp, piercing through the lens at his sons. Elias, Julian, the recording began. I built an empire for you, and I watched you tear it down for a shadow. I knew about Marcus's plan months ago. I knew he was siphoning funds. I knew he was whispering in your ears. And I let him. The brothers gasped, turning their heads toward Marcus. Marcus sat perfectly still, a thin, mocking smile on his lips. Arthur continued, I let him because a kingdom is only as strong as its heirs. If you could be defeated by a single advisor, you were never fit to lead. However, I am a Sterling. I don't leave my blood with nothing. He revealed that he had a secret offshore trust, a contingency fund worth $500 million, accessible only if the brothers signed a joint agreement of reconciliation and a pledge to never work for a Sterling-branded company again. For a moment, hope surged, but then came the final clause. This fund is currently held in an account that requires 3 signatures for release: Elias's, Julian's, and Marcus's. Arthur's video me led. Marcus has been my most loyal enemy. To get the money, you must convince the man who destroyed you to give it back. Good luck. The real twist wasn't the existence of the money. It was that Marcus already knew about the fund. In fact, he had helped Arthur set it up years ago. Arthur hadn't found out about Marcus. They had made a twisted pact. Arthur wanted to test if his sons would ever choose family over greed, even at the very end. But Marcus had a different plan. He knew the brothers would never humble themselves enough to beg him. And he had no intention of signing. The money was a mirage, a carrot on a stick designed to keep the brothers fighting for a prize they could never touch. This is the intermittent reinforcement and the scarcity trap. By giving them a glimmer of hope, the fund, Arthur and Marcus ensured the brothers stayed obsessed with the past rather than moving on. It also utilizes triangulation, a manipulation tactic where a third person, Marcus, is used to control the relationship between 2 others. By making Marcus the gatekeeper, Arthur ensured his sons would remain subservient to their destroyer for the rest of their lives. Hope can be a weapon of control. If your rescue depends on the mercy of your enemy, you aren't being saved, you're being taunted. Sometimes, the only way to win a rigged game is to stop playing and walk away from the prize, even if it's worth millions. Part 11. The Beggar's Bargain. Pride is the last thing a dying man loses. But for those who want to live, pride is the first thing they must kill. How much is your dignity worth when your stomach is empty and your future is a locked door? Elias and Julian Sterling are about to find out that the price of a signature isn't money. It's their very soul. A month of living in the shadows of New York had broken the brothers. Elias was losing his hair from stress, and Julian's charismatic glow had been replaced by the sallow skin of a man who skipped meals. The $500 million trust fund was their only hope, their only bridge back to the life they felt they deserved. But that bridge was guarded by Marcus. They requested a meeting. Marcus, now the undisputed CEO of the reorganized Sterling Global, made them wait for 6 hours in the lobby of the very building that used to bear their father's name. When he finally summoned them, he didn't do it in the boardroom. He met them in the basement garage, near the trash compactors. The message was clear. This was where they belonged. "We need the signature, Marcus," Elias said, his voice trembling. "Our father wanted us to have that money. You've taken everything else. Just sign the papers and let us go." Marcus leaned against his armored SUV, lighting a cigar, a habit Arthur used to have. "Arthur wanted to test you." Marcus smiled. "And you failed. You're here, begging. That's not what a sterling does. But, I'm a businessman. I'll sign. For a price." He tossed 2 documents onto the greasy concrete floor. They weren't legal papers, they were confessions. Marcus demanded that each brother sign a detailed, notarized statement admitting to the very crimes Marcus had framed them for. The embezzlement and the negligence that led to Arthur's coma. "If you sign these, I sign the trust papers," Marcus said, "but remember, once you sign these, I can have you arrested the moment you touch that money. You'll be rich, yes, but you'll be rich in a prison cell." The brothers looked at each other, and for a split second, a flash of their old rivalry returned. Marcus added one more condition. "There's only enough in the trust to pay for one of you to stay out of jail. One signs the confession and goes to prison, the other gets the money and stays free. Decide now, who loves the other enough to sacrifice their life for a paycheck?" This is the ultimatum game, played with high-stakes malice. Marcus was using coercive persuasion to break their remaining bond. By introducing a zero-sum game, one wins, one loses, he reactivated the deep-seated sibling rivalry he had nurtured from the start. This is also a form of dehumanization, by forcing them to meet in a garage and sign confessions. He stripped them of their human dignity, making them easier to manipulate. When an enemy offers you a deal, look for the hidden cage. A bargain made in desperation is never a bargain, it's a surrender. The person who controls your options always ensures that no matter what you choose, they're the only ones who truly win. Part 12. The Final. In the game of power, there is no happily ever after. There is only the survivor and the lesson. The Sterling brothers thought they were fighting for a fortune, but they were actually fighting for their own extinction. As the final curtain falls, remember this. The shadow you ignore today might just be the one that buries you tomorrow. The decision in the garage took less than a minute. Elias, the elder, the one who always claimed he would protect the family, didn't hesitate. He grabbed the pen and signed the confession. But he did it with a condition. He wanted the money transferred to a private account before he surrendered to the authorities. Julian, however, was faster. He tackled his brother, the two of them rolling on the oil-stained concrete, fighting like animals over a piece of paper. Marcus watched them, a look of profound boredom on his face. He didn't intervene. He didn't need to. He simply pulled out his phone and made a single call. Within seconds, the garage was flooded with the blue and red lights of the NYPD. Marcus hadn't waited for their choice. He had tipped off the police hours ago about a meeting of fugitives. As the brothers were handcuffed and led away, still screaming accusations at one another, Marcus stood by his SUV. He didn't sign the trust papers. He never intended to. With the brothers now officially confessed criminals and Arthur dead, the $500 million trust fund, by a clause Marcus himself had drafted, defaulted back to the Sterling Group, which Marcus now owned. The story ends not in a courtroom, but in the CEO's office. Marcus sat in Arthur's old chair, looking out at the city. He picked up a small chess piece from the desk, a black knight, and tossed it into the trash can. He had achieved the impossible. He had deleted a bloodline and replaced it with a shadow. He was no longer the outsider. He was the empire. But as he looked at his own reflection in the window, he noticed his young assistant standing in the doorway, watching him with the same quiet, invisible loyalty Marcus once showed Arthur. The cycle was ready to begin again. The ultimate twist? Arthur Sterling knew Marcus would win. The trust fund was never meant to save his sons. It was a final gift to Marcus for being a better student of power than Elias or Julian ever were. Arthur's final recorded words, which Marcus played only for himself, were, "The blood is weak. Marcus, take it all. You've earned it by being more ruthless than the man who raised you." This is the succession paradox and the cycle of Machiavellianism. Arthur prioritized the survival of the empire over the survival of his children. In his twisted mind, Marcus was the true heir because Marcus possessed the dark triad traits: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, necessary to maintain power. The assistant at the end represents the replacement theory in hierarchies built on manipulation. Every predator eventually becomes the prey of the one they trained to be invisible. Loyalty is often just a lack of opportunity to betray. If you build your life on the suffering of others, you create a vacuum that only a monster can fill. Power doesn't change people, it unmasks them. And once the mask is off, there is no going back to the light. The Sterling Empire didn't fall because of a bad economy or a strong competitor. It fell because of a whisper in the dark and a pride that refused to bend. Remember, in the world of power, the most dangerous person is the one you don't see coming, the one who serves you with a smile while sharpening the blade. Marcus won because he understood one thing that the brothers forgot: to control the game. You must first master the players. If this story opened your eyes to the hidden games being played around you, hit the like button and subscribe to join the Dark Mind Society story. Knowledge is your only shield against manipulation. What would you have done in Elias or Julian's position? Let us know in the comments below. The game never ends, only the players change. Stay sharp, stay observant. I'm your host, and I'll see you in the next shadow. Goodbye for now.